you are not we will, what we've arranged to do is Christian and I are going to have a discussion for the better part of, 40 minutes or so. Then we'll open it up for questions. We urge you to use the raised hand function or to type in the chat room a question that you have, and we'll try to keep track of it and get to as many of those questions as we can. So with that, let me introduce Christian Ostermann. I've wanted to have Christian here as a speaker for a very long time. He is a distinguished historian. He is at the Woodrow Wilson Center and is a prime example of history outside the academy. What can you do if you're not going to be in a classroom teaching history? He has directed the Cold War studies program there, and now is the director of the history and public policy section of the Wilson Center. He's won the Berlin Prize. He has fostered things like documentation collection out of North Korea, and has truly been a world citizen for history. So Christian has written this book, just came out this spring, called Between Containment and Rollback. And it is Germany between 1945 and 1953, the United States and the Cold War in Germany, with the focus on East Germany. We mostly have thought, I think, about West Germany as part of the Cold War story of the United States, and Christian is setting out to correct that. So, Christian, most of us in this session remember when unification happened. Most of us may not remember when partition happened. You weren't even born then, I think, when partition happened. So why did you decide to write this book looking at basically 45 to 53 and the breakup of Germany?
Thank you, Trudy. Let me first begin by saying what a pleasure and honor and privilege it is to be here with you tonight. Looking forward to our discussion. It's wonderful. Let me thank the organizers, Trudy, of course, but also the team behind the scene. I know this from hosting a few dozen meetings a year, that there's the busy part, the hard part is producing these events behind the scenes. So a shout out to those involved. Let me just say it's such a pleasure to be on the stage, so to speak, or at least in the Zoom room with Trudy, who is herself a national treasure in this country, having served as deputy and acting national archivist, and in so many other capacities. And for me, as somebody who professionally is engaged in exploring and opening up archives around the world, has always been, as I just mentioned to a couple of you before the session, sort of a wonderful resource, and somebody who we would try to meet up between our busy schedules every few months to catch up. And Trudy's always full of exciting new leads and news. So I was and continues to be, and so I'm thrilled to be with her here tonight. And let me also just do a shout out to Avis Boland, who at least at some point was part of the discussion, a cherished former fellow at the Wilson Center and colleague, and of course a very distinguished ambassador of this country. So why did I come to write this book? As you maybe detect from my accent, and I'm hoping I'm coming through loud and clear. Yeah. As you maybe detect from an accent, I grew up in Germany. I was actually born in the US, but grew up in Germany, and grew up in divided Cold War Germany in the western part. America's Germany, as one book puts it, and was always fascinated by the other Germany that it was very hard to get to. I recall my senior year high school trip was to East Germany back in 1983, 84. And that was an amazing experience, meeting with persecuted church members in back alleys, but also tasting the awful, awful, awful East German chocolate, which will forever remain sort of seared into my memory as a chocolate connoisseur. So I was fascinated by East Germany at the time. Then when I began my doctoral work, I had a chance to work for a research organization in Berlin in the former East German Party and State archives. Just after they were opened, after unification in 1990, 1991, 1992, the Germans decided that in order for the country to come to terms with its divided past, they would open up the files of the former East German Communist Party, the party that led East Germany for its 4 decades. And so historians finally had a chance to get into those formerly top secret archives. So that steered me further into that direction of studying East Germany through its archives. And then I came to do my dissertation research here in Washington at the US National Archives, and I ended up getting a job at the National Security Archive, which is a terrific private research organization based at GW. And I worked on the US side of the German-American relationship. And then from the National Security Archive, with its focus on the US sources, I went over to the Wilson Center, where, as Trudy mentioned, I have been running for close to 3 decades a Cold War international history project, a project that was set up just after the collapse of the East European communist regimes and the collapse of the Soviet Union, to integrate the sources, the records, the formally classified files into the international history. And so this is what got me to write this book. It started out as a dissertation project, I have to confess, and it's taken me, because of my day job, many, many years to finish it, and I've worked on it off and on over the years. But I'm glad to, and my family's even gladder to finally see it in print and no longer have it to be the subject of increasingly painful questions at family reunions. You know, when is Christian finally going to finish his book? I'm deep into the next book because as these things go, any of you who have written books know that it takes a couple of years to actually produce the book after you hand in the manuscript. So I'm glad to see it, and I've had to go back and read it to familiarize myself with the subject. Anyways, that's in a nutshell how I came to write a book about the US relationship or the US policy towards East Germany, initially in 1945 to 1949, when the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and the United States occupied Germany. It was the United States and the Soviet zone. And after 1949, when Germany was divided and two separate German states came into existence, it was looking at the US relationship, US policy towards East Germany.
Christian, a lot of us who remember the Cold War period see it through an ideological lens. Those were the communists over in East Germany, and those of us in the West were capitalists or Democrats, depending on what your flavor was. You take a different approach. You start to look at this split in very much economic terms. What made you decide that economics was the driver here?
Well, It's economics was clearly important. It's a complicated story. I started out with the first couple of chapters really deal with the division of Germany, the deal with the clash of the Soviet Union and the United States at the Potsdam Conference outside of Berlin in July 1945. The first major post-war meeting between the big three, US, the Soviet Union, and the UK. The French joined later. What I try to show in this first chapter and why economics plays in is, of course, that initially it was all about the economy in a way, because when the Americans got into Germany and took on the responsibility of running the American occupation zone, the zones had been decided during the war between, how they were split up between the Russians and the Americans and the Brits. When they started running their zone, they realized quickly that the food situation in West Germany was terrible. So the immediate challenge was not a political one. It was taking care of a country or half a country or a portion of a country that they just assumed in June 1945 supreme authority over. The formerly defeated, the former German Reich, now defeated by the Allied troops, but suddenly it was Allied, it was American responsibility to take care of the people in their zone. So in the first chapter of the book, what I show is that what really mattered was that at Potsdam, lots of things were decided. The Allies decided Germany should be democratized, decentralized, decartelized, a number of things. Within all that thicket of resolutions that came out of that conference was one clause that really decided the future of Germany and led the way or paved the way towards division, which was that Russians and Americans decided that reparations from Germany, how Germany would make good on the huge devastation it wreaked on the Soviet Union as well as the European countries, that for reparations, each side, each zone would help itself out of its own zone. That is, the Allies would not treat Germany as an economic unity. The Soviets would help themselves to whatever resources they wanted to get out of Eastern Germany to speed up their recovery after the war. And the Americans and the British would take whatever they needed, much less so, out of Western Germany. And this put the Soviet occupation zone and the Western occupation zones on very different economic tracks, which ultimately underscored and led to the political division of the country in 1949. The reason why I focus in my first chapter on Potsdam is that the Americans initially came into the conference thinking about Germany as a whole, as one country, as an economic unit. Mm-hmm. And were convinced that in order to make it work there, they needed to resurrect the German economy, not just the West German economy, but also the East German economy, the economy as a whole in Germany. They were very focused on the Rhein-Ruhr-Gebiet. I don't know if any of you have been to Germany, but really the industrial heartland of Germany is the Rhine-Ruhr Valley in the very west of the country. The Americans and the British who occupied the western part of Germany were very much focused on resurrecting that industry to help resurrect Germany's economy as a whole, as well as Western Europe's economy. See, the great fear after the war on the part of the Americans was not that they feared a Soviet attack on Europe, on Western Europe. That was not the fear. The Soviet Union, they knew, was thoroughly debilitated by the war of aggression that the Germans fought against the Soviet Union after 1941. Huge devastation. 26 something million people, military as well as civilian population killed. Millions of buildings, schools, libraries, hospitals, destroyed. So they knew the Soviet Union would not attack the West at that point. What they were worried about, what the administration of Harry S. Truman, who took over from Franklin Roosevelt in April 1945, what they were worried about is that with the chaos and the economic chaos and the political exhaustion by people throughout Europe at the end of the war, the communists and the Soviet Union would exploit this chaos, would exploit this dislocation, would exploit the political troubles. And so the Americans wanted to rehabilitate Western Europe as quickly as possible, and they knew Germany was the key to that. So the focus was on the economic rehabilitation of Germany. So Truman arrives with his delegation in Potsdam outside of Berlin, and they had their worries about the Soviets. There were troublesome developments in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in other parts of the world, Iran. They were concerned about the Soviets. They even had heard about the Soviet dismantling efforts in Germany after they started to occupy and defeat and then occupy the eastern part of Germany. What was overwhelming was the sense of the Soviets had literally taken every last spoon, every last bit of industrial equipment out of Berlin and out of East Germany. Between the time that the Soviets who reached Berlin first, occupied Berlin, and the time that the Americans at the beginning of July moved into Berlin, there were 8 weeks. And in those 8 weeks, the Soviets dismantled, took away, shipped off 50% of Berlin's industrial capacity alone. And they did so in much of the rest of the Eastern zone. So when Truman arrived there, they were literally shocked by this. And this sort of sense of the Eastern German industrial being taken away by the Soviets convinced Truman and his advisors that there wasn't going to be some sort of joint governance with the Soviets of Germany as they had initially anticipated, but that they actually had to agree with the Soviets that each side would just run its own zone, or zones in the Western case, and that in terms of reparations, in terms of any further sort of financial or economic resources they would take out of Germany, the Soviets would limit themselves to the East, and the West would take out what it needed out of the West. Now, Stalin agreed to this against the advice, as we now know, based on Russian and East German sources, against the advice of his advisors. They all said, you're crazy. East Germany, or the Soviet zone at the time, only has a small portion of the industrial capacity of Germany. Eastern Germany, what became later Eastern Germany, was the kind of the agricultural hinterland of the West German industry. And so they said that you shouldn't agree to this. We want to get our hands in on the industry centers in the Rhine-Ruhr. We need reparations out of West Germany. Stalin, as we now know, was really not that concerned about reparations. The initial numbers he was thinking about tabling with the West were far smaller than what was later agreed on and what his advisors asked for. What he was concerned about is maintaining exclusive control over the Soviet zone, over the part of Germany that the Russians had occupied and now controlled. And that was the overriding goal of Stalin. He certainly had further goals, but this was sort of a red line. And so he happily, against the advice of his advisors, agreed to this, what's called the zonal reparations solution. And so this is what came out of Potsdam. This is what was agreed on in Potsdam, and you have American officials coming out of Potsdam, and somebody like John J. McCloy, who was worked at the War Department at the time, later became High Commissioner and sort of ambassador to Western Germany, said we're sliding towards a line down the middle of Germany. That's late summer in 45. Actual German division, the establishment of two German states did not happen until September, October 1949. So you have this sense on the part of some that this solution of separating the reparations deal between East and West Germany put the zones on two very different tracks. Let me stop there, but that's why I sort of start with the economy. Economics. It's really about reparations. It's about rebuilding West Germany. It's about the Americans, realized once they got into Germany, they actually had to import food into Western Germany. Things were that terrible. Now that sounds good to might have sounded good to the Germans, but to American taxpayers who had just funded a war against the Germans, this was probably not very palatable. And so what Truman agreed on was that he said, we need to pay for whatever we import into Germany in terms of foodstuffs. We need to pay that by any exports that are going to come out of Germany in the early period after the war. And because they wanted to pay with the imports, they were interested in reviving the German economy. So it's really is a lot about the economy in those early days, and then politics take over. We may get to that maybe later in the discussion.
In fact, that was where I was going to go. I was going to skip ahead because, again, as people of the age of most of your audience, we grew up hearing about containment and all of the things that we were doing to make sure that the Soviet Union didn't expand, that we kept them in their borders. We didn't hear as much about rollback, of trying to push back against the controls that the Soviet Union had over places like East Germany. And yet I think you're arguing that we did more of that than is normally assumed. There certainly was radio in the American sector. And at least in early Eisenhower, there were these programs that were called things like Grass is Greener, where the idea was to flood all kinds of supplies along the border so that people in East Germany could look over and see the grass is greener if we come across the border. Balance out for us the containment and rollback kind of debates in the US.
Sure, sure. Trudy, you're quite right. Usually when historians have written about the American-German relationship after the war, it's all about the United States integrating Western Germany, what would become the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949, into West European and Atlantic structures in terms of the economy and also militarily. Germany, in 1955 joins NATO. And a lot of this is about deterring, we have the Marshall Plan, among other things. We have West German rearmament. A lot of this is about containing the Soviet threat, but very much focused on Western Germany. Historians have come up with this notion of double containment, that the United States contained the Soviet Union in Europe, sought to contain the Soviet Union in Europe, as well as Germany, the rise of German nationalism. But what my book really tries to get at is something that only a whole bunch of Freedom of Information Act requests that I actually sent to the acting national archivist. At least you were on my letterhead there. When Trudy, back in the day when Trudy was running the National Archives, I went to the National Archives and looked at the files and tried to see what's in there on East Germany. And many of the files were withdrawn, still classified. So I, thinking that, I have all the time in the world as a student, filed all these FOIA requests. And lo and behold, years later, I received thousands of pages of declassified documents. And at least at the time, I don't know if things have changed, Trudy, but then the National Archives would actually send these copies to you at your home once they released them. And this was part of a trend at the time in the 1990s when the US government was releasing vast amounts of materials under the Clinton administration, including a lot of materials on the more the darker sides of American policy, if you want, the more records on those things that pushed well beyond kind of just defending, containing against communism, but actually show that the United States, from the beginning of the Cold War, certainly tried to contain the Soviet Union, but at the same time sought in a variety of ways to actually push back Soviet power from Europe and other places where it had taken over. And so my book takes advantage of these records and shows that even with regard to East Germany, where things in Europe were very, very much, very dangerous along the Iron Curtain, were very much set once the two East German states came into existence. Nobody really wanted to mess with that status quo a whole lot. And yet the documents show that there were a number of people inside the Truman and later the Eisenhower administration who really wanted to push further than just containing the Soviets to East Germany. They wanted to get the Soviets out of East Germany. Many Germans wanted that. They wanted German unity. They wanted German reunification. The Americans wanted unification, but on their terms. And this was certainly pushing back the Soviets, wasn't all just about German unity. So I can show, I show in my book that first in the early years before the establishment of the two German states, General Clay, who became the military governor of Germany, had a very expansive notion of American influence throughout Germany. He actually, I remember I just said at Potsdam, the two sides agreed to separate the occupation regime and kind of each help itself to its own zone. Clay didn't get the message. He actually read the Potsdam Protocol literally and very much thought that the United States should try to achieve economic unity in Germany, because that would allow the US to extend its influence into the Soviet zone, something the Soviets were aghast at. Clay tried to do this initially by cooperating with the Soviets. I call it rollback by cooperation. He tried to strike a reparations deal with them. He tried to engage them in all German efforts while during the occupation regime. It didn't come to anything. As I just mentioned, Stalin's priority was to maintain exclusive control of East Germany, but Clay tried, and the Soviet records we now have access to show how hard Clay tried and how much the Soviets really understood what he was after. In the end, it didn't come to anything. Clay got outraged by Soviet intransigence and really sort of did a 180 and became a fervent anti-communist campaigner and started very abruptly in the fall of 1947 a anti-communist campaign in the Western occupation zones. Once we get to German division and the two establishment of the two German states, I show, maybe some people in the Truman administration had hoped, well, now that we have two German states, things have stabilized. Maybe we're good. Maybe this isn't such a big problem anymore. As it turns out, in the end, they didn't get to sort of reap that sort of harvest from German division. In fact, there was a sense that with the East German state, where the communists were in charge and running the show, Stalin actually had a terrific way to influence Germany, influence West Germany. And so there was a new sense of vulnerability on the part of the Truman administration in those early 1950s, heightened in June 1950 when the Korean War broke out, when many people thought there would be kind of many people thought the North Koreans were a proxy of Stalin, of the Soviets, and they were to a large extent. They thought, hey, the same thing could happen in Germany. There's an echo somewhere.
Can everybody please mute, except for Christian, and maybe we'll get rid of the echo.
After the North Korean attack of the South, many, including McCloy, but certainly many of the Germans felt that something similar might happen to West Germany. The East Germans might now, with Soviet support, attack West Germany. And so, the Americans feel a sense of threat in Germany. And it's because of this threat that they build up West Germany, turn it into a prosperous, vibrant democracy, integrate it with the West economically, militarily. But they also feel the need to push back on communism in East Germany and to develop a host of programs now declassified that I detail in my book. throughout the chapter. Some of these scenarios that the Americans, that officials developed within the Truman administration were, were really wild. I mean, there's a famous plan developed by Hans Speyer, name some of you might be familiar with. He worked at the Rand Corporation, and Wallace Carroll, a journalist, ran the Winston-Salem Journal. Both of them wrote a report on contract for the US government in 1950, outlining a scenario where the United States would engage in assassination attempts, in explosions and sabotage in East Germany, in basically directing a massive resistance movement inside East Germany from the West to upset the communists. That was an extreme plan, but what I can show is that there were lots of other ideas and plans that found their way into American policy at the time. So, as Trudy said, I'm trying to show that that American policy in Germany was not just about containing the Soviet threat, but actually pushing against the East German communists and the Soviets in East Germany.
Christian, that takes me to my last question, and that is if you would do a little background on the 1953 revolt in East Germany, and then the allegation that the US had its fingers in the pie.
Sure. So in 1953, you get the first major uprising behind the Iron Curtain. On June 17, we just passed the anniversary, in East Germany, communist East Germany, thousands, millions of people rose up, led by workers, but other segments of East German societies joining in hundreds of East German cities throughout that country to protest, to demonstrate against the East German communist regime and the Soviet and their Soviet masters. This uprising lasts for several days, but eventually is suppressed by the Soviets. They come in with military might. Tanks appear in Berlin, where the uprising, in East Berlin, where the uprising started, and all over East Germany, the insurrection, the revolt is put down. It's the first of a number of internal shocks and tremors and uprisings within the East Bloc that shock the Soviet Empire. 1953, East Germany; 1956, the Hungarian Revolution; 1968, the Prague Spring, and so forth. So it's the first major uprising behind the Iron Curtain. From day one, the Soviets and later the East Germans, once they kind of the East German leadership, once they recovered from the shock of the uprising, argued that the Americans were behind this. I show in my book that the Americans were as surprised by the uprising, which was a homegrown uprising, were as surprised as the Soviets. The uprising, in fact, had come into being because in late 1952, East Germany's very ambitious little Stalinist dictator, Walter Ulbricht, hardline guy, had put East Germany on track to be Sovietized, really revved up the socialization and collectivization policies with massive, massive dislocations throughout the country and massive, massive repressive actions against the population, which led to mass flights towards West Germany. At the time, we don't have the wall. That comes in 1961. But really digging, really forcing things to a head in East Germany. And as a result, you get this uprising. It's interesting. The Americans were surprised. They actually, at that very time, thought that the Americans had finally wrapped or finally come to understand in their view that Ulbricht was actually fairly secure in his positions. I talked about some of the rollback policies that they developed in 1950, 51, 52. It's very ironic, but by the time the uprising happens, you find in American dispatches from Berlin and elsewhere saying there's no way the East Germans will rise up. Ulbricht, the East German leader, is secure in his position, even after Stalin, who dies in March 1953, a massive shakeup of a massive event, an epochal event for people behind the Iron Curtain. Even after Stalin dies and there are ripples of unrest throughout the Soviet Empire, Ulbricht seems to regain his strength, his position seems secure. This, of course, was very much a misperception. Ulbricht was, at the height of the uprising, was nearly toppled. It's only due to his machinations that he actually manages to survive this crisis in East Germany. Having said the US was surprised, I'm not saying it was an innocent bystander. Trudy already mentioned radio in the American sector, the American radio in West Berlin, enormously popular in East Germany, helped turn what was a local demonstration in Berlin quickly into a countrywide rebellion or revolt, because it broadcast the news. The RIAS employees were very committed to reporting the news factually, but they did report the demonstrations in Berlin, and that helped to spread the uprising. They also put later in the course of the uprising some of the German commentators and German politicians on live, and those editorials were far more sort of encouraging further resistance. So the radio played a role, the American radio played a role. And you have in Washington, with the new Eisenhower administration in office since March, came into the office promising the liberation of the captive peoples of Eastern Europe, great expectations among several people within the administration that this now is finally the moment where we can roll up the Soviets in East Germany for keeps. There are long debates in Washington. I talk about them within the highest level, within the National Security Council, of what to do. The whole thing is complicated by the fact that that American intelligence, actually, it turned out that on June 17, the height of the uprising, just about every top US official in Germany was out of pocket. Ambassador Conant, the High Commissioner, was in Washington. His public affairs chief, who ran all of the sort of psychological warfare stuff vis-a-vis East Germany, was out of pocket. And American intelligence agents had a very hard time understanding the full depth and extent of the uprising. There's in some ways, a real intelligence failure there initially. It only gets, with very much delay, to Washington only learns with quite a bit of delay that this uprising is so widespread. That sort of is one reason for the initial hesitation. But then Eisenhower really comes down in the kind of key session of the National Security Council where he says, this uprising would have to spread to China and elsewhere for us to really go in militarily and support the insurrectionists. And with that, the cold warriors within the Eisenhower administrations, the hotheads in some ways around C.D. Jackson and other psychological warriors were stumped. And they came up with a program, a number of activities, but the major thing that came out of this as the American response was a food program for East Germans, the so-called Eisenhower packages.
No.
Actually brilliant idea. They ship old army rations as well as other foodstuffs to Berlin and have East Germans come to pick up these food packages. It's something they thought the East Germans could surely not turn down, food aid to their citizen. And it gives East Germans, in the wake of the uprising, another way of showing defiance of the regime and, support of the West. One of the terrific things about the East German archives that I worked in now is that in addition to the whole US story of this, I can show how the East Germans reacted to all of this. And what we have is the party, the East German Communist Party, was very good at monitoring the East German population. So you have all these reports coming back to Berlin from all over the country where people trying their in ingenious ways to get on a train to Berlin to pick up their food package, and it helps to keep the East German regime off balance for a while. But it only works for a while, and so it's a short-lived effort. And in the aftermath, many wonder what was the point of it. And shouldn't we be more careful about encouraging this kind of thing? I'll leave it at that.
We have a question in the chat from Shirley Rosenfeld, who thanks you for a fascinating presentation and says, moving forward in time to post-reunification, anecdotally, we've been told by some more senior Germans that they regretted the dislocation and economic uncertainty resulting from reunification. To what extent has the younger generation moved away from this ambiguity and embraced reunification?
I've been away from Germany for several decades now, so I'm probably not the right person to ask. How has the young generation embraced? I think there's it's been easier for the younger generation to embrace the opportunities in a united Germany and a ever more united Europe. I think it's been the older generations who've had the toughest time in making this transition from communism, from a socialized state to socialist state to capitalism, market economy, and democracy. So, but I'm not an expert on contemporary Germany. I'll say that. So that's just anecdotal, experience on my part.
Tom Zaniello is asking, you've talked about the immense Soviet take of materials out of their zone at the end of the war. But what physical objects, machinery, and so forth did Allies take out of West Germany?
There were, the Western Allies had different agendas. I think there were the French, having suffered at German hands, like some of the other smaller European countries, Western European countries, had similar needs for capital equipment and other things. I think in terms of the US, I think there was a primary interest in intellectual property and science and technology, these kinds of things, rather than sort of massive industrial goods. I'm sure there was some as well, but overall, West Germany's reparation payments to the West were minimal compared to what East Germans saw being shipped off out of their zone and their country. Reparations continued well into the early 1950s for most East Germans.
And Christian, Avis Bolin has her hand raised, and let's make sure we get her question in. Avis,
absolutely.
To unmute yourself.
Yes, Christian, first of all, thank you for your very kind words earlier. I have so many questions and I can't wait to read your book, but I guess the one I would ask is just being now concentrated on the Eisenhower administration and the propaganda efforts that you refer to, and C.D. Jackson, who was Eisenhower's sort of propaganda czar. He sounds like an agate prop person from the Soviet Union at times.
Yeah.
How would you compare the Eisenhower effort with what was going on in the Truman administration, which was something, but it seems to me that it was really ramped up under Eisenhower, who was himself, even though moderate in many ways, but he himself was a great believer in propaganda.
Absolutely. I think what the declassified record now shows is that a lot more of this was going on under the Truman administration as well. You know, Eisenhower won the election campaign because he said, Truman is too defensive, containment is too defensive. We need to go and liberate the captive people of Eastern Europe. Peacefully, he would add, but that sort of often got drowned out in the campaign, to the extent that foreign policy played any role at all in election campaigns. But the sort of liberation of the captive people of Eastern Europe, rollback, was a big slogan, a big foreign policy slogan of Eisenhower, and a critique of Truman. As it turns out, the Truman administration did far more than it let on, far more that we had access to in terms of the records for many years. So I actually see quite a bit of a continuity there between Truman and Eisenhower. There was talk about a great counteroffensive against the Soviet Union, even during the Truman administration. But you're right, of course, that with C.D. Jackson, Eisenhower picked someone who was very outspoken, who was, I think, the publisher of Time Life. Is that right, Avis? He had been prominent in the publishing world. So he was a well-known entity who Eisenhower elevated to the top levels of his administration. And with that kind of gave the whole rollback rhetoric really some visibility and credibility, unlike what Truman had done earlier. C.D. Jackson is he's very much a character, and my chapter on 1953 deals a lot with him because he is sort of at the extreme end of the discussions of should the United States militarily intervene in East Germany in 1953. Can you imagine what would have happened if the United States would have militarily supported the East German insurrectionists? The Soviet Union, it's clear from the files we now have, already looked at this as a Cold War crisis, as something that had to be put down militarily, and were prepared to see this as a confrontation with the West from the very beginning. And this is at a time when both sides had nuclear weapons, small arsenals, but nonetheless. So this could have quickly spiraled into a nuclear conflagration had not wiser heads like the president prevailed.
Eisenhower never ever believed in military rollback, and Dulles
Exactly.
didn't either, but they supported the rhetoric. Yeah.
The rhetoric was something that you know, you have to look at it in the context of an election campaign. He wanted to critique Truman's otherwise very successful foreign policy. So he depicted Truman as somebody who was defensive, who was stagnant. And he wanted to project an image of an activist foreign policy, and roll back was part of this. And as I said, he always said peaceful, but I think both to his domestic audience as well as to many people in Eastern Europe who heard, hey, Eisenhower is promising liberation, the peaceful part sort of, you know, was hard to decipher, hard to hear. And so there were a lot of expectations that Eisenhower would, really take on the Soviet Union. He, as you said, he was a much more tempered in his foreign policy instincts in many ways.
Well, thank you, Christian. We could go on clearly for a long time more. I've got many more questions, and I'm sure people in the audience do, but we are at the end of our hour. Thank you very, very much. And
Welcome.
Everybody,
Thank you.
good night and see you in September.
See you.
Hey,
Yes.
Trudy. Thank you,
Take care.
Kristen. Good night, everybody.